Hello, my name is John Canning. I'm the project advisor on the SPEAK project, and I'm joined today by Simon Kemp, who is Principal Teaching Fellow in Environmental Sciences here at the University of Southampton, and he's also been given a National Teaching Fellowship. So he's had this recognition nationally, so thank you for joining us,
thank you for the invitation.
Simon. And Simon's also won the recent award for the most innovative teacher in the university, so congratulations on that, Simon. So Simon, you've received a lot of recognition for your teaching work, both from students and from your peers. One of the things we'd like to talk about today is particularly about feedback, both to students and from students. Now, we often see that feedback is sort of like the lowest, has the lowest levels of satisfaction among students when they report on the National Student Survey, and other evidence seems to back this up, this lack of satisfaction. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, I think there's a number of factors, but I think the main overriding factor is sometimes students don't quite understand or recognise when they are receiving feedback. I think one of the concerns that I always have is that, for example, I think sometimes students expect feedback to be in the way they might receive it in school or in further education colleges, which traditionally has always been written feedback. If you look at a written feedback, then students will see that it's on a sheet which says feedback, and they will then know that that is their feedback for their mark. Most people will only naturally still go to the mark first and then look at the feedback, but at least they'd recognise that it's on a sheet which is labelled as such. One of the things that I try to do in a lot of my lectures, whether it's at different stages through the module, but also towards the end of the module and around assessments, is to give feedback on an ongoing basis, but to give it verbally. I think you can give a lot more detail verbally. I know some lecturers experiment with giving the feedback they record it on a digital, on a phone, or some sort of feedback mechanism like that, some sort of digital recorder, and then they will send that as a file by email. I've experimented with that. I was never entirely satisfied with it because there was always a worry that you're sending the wrong file by email to somebody. So there's little risks there.
Right, yes. Yeah.
But I think that students do respond better to verbal feedback in some ways, but they don't necessarily recognise it as such. A useful example is there's a module I teach called Environmental Management Systems, and the way that I teach that is basically you can't really learn about an environmental management system in an organisation just simply by learning the theory and then writing an examination and then you get the exam mark back at the end. You've got to be able to understand what it means to a business, and you've got to be able to develop the business interaction skills. So what I do with that module is I teach the theory, and then they have to implement an environmental management system in a real organisation. And we change the company every year for this. The reason being that at the end of it, the company get a manual which is up to the international standard of ISO 14001, and they can then get that international award on the basis of the work of the students. The point is that through that mechanism, students are receiving feedback every single week. Because what we do is, once they've learned the theory for one section of the EMS, they then use the data they got from the case study organisation to develop that section of the manual. We then make them present, as a consultancy organisation, that part of the manual. So they'll then present to me, and what I'll do then is I'll then give them verbal feedback on their presentation. It's not written feedback because it's not an assessed exercise, so it doesn't have to be formally recorded in that way, but it's verbal feedback every single week. So it gives them feedback in terms of their progress. If they're making any errors, if they're going down a misjudged path and they need correcting, then I can say to them, you might need to think about X, you might need to look at this element of their activities. Your focus there is great, but you need to build on this. So it's give them feedback every single week, but also it's help them develop their presentation skills. They then will give feedback to us at the end of the module, and they'll say whether or not that then helped them develop their presentation skills. So it's a two-way feedback process. The other elements of feedback within that module are when they've handed in their environmental management system manual to me as the consultancy organisation for the client. So say, for example, this year we worked with Scandia Insurance down town. We've done previously Westquay Shopping Centre, City Council, hospital, places like that. They'll give in their manual, and then myself and a colleague and somebody external I bring in will then interrogate them essentially
Right.
for an hour on that manual, asking them to explain to us what they did for that piece of work and get them to justify it under the auspices of saying it's a certification audit, so it's replicating real life practice of what would happen in that sort of situation with the discipline. Typically, an external auditor would come in and they would say, does this meet the international standard? Why does it? Why doesn't it? Etc. So we replicate that process, they learn that way. But we're giving them feedback as we're going through the manual. But what we'll also do is, I'll have gone through and marked them, and I'll have 6 or 7 pages of feedback on individual parts of the manual, and I'll go through bits of that during the hour-long audit. So they're getting verbal feedback at that point, but they're also getting the opportunity to explain what they've done through that process as well. I think that's an important thing that people sometimes miss with moving on to, we'll come back to feedback in a second, but moving on to assessment. I think it's an important thing that people miss, is that a complaint you get from students in terms of feedback to lecturers, well, at least I try to have an open relationship with my students so they can come and talk to these things. They sometimes say they get frustrated when they'll hand in a piece of work and they'll get a bit of feedback which doesn't actually meet what they meant by their piece of work, and they don't then have the opportunity to explain what they meant by that piece of work. When we're in that certification process, what I'm doing is I'm giving them the opportunity to explain what they did, why they came to that conclusion, what that actually means. Because sometimes if you didn't mark in written text, you can misinterpret information, you can misinterpret what that data means. So give them the opportunity to do that. So at that point in time, all of the marks are still draft, and the marks can go up or down depending on the content of the actual audit session. So we give them verbal feedback and then give them the 6 or 7 pages worth of written up feedback at the end. They then have to make the changes and corrections to that manual and give it to the organisation. They then have to present that manual to the organisation, and they then have to present that as a consultancy. So they have to stand up, present to the board of directors. The board of directors will then give them feedback on what they thought they did in terms of acting as consultants, so they're learning consultancy skills, and they ask them questions which then force them to try to think more clearly about what they've done within the manual and explain it. And then at the end of all that, we then have a feedback session at the end of the module, which then gives them the feedback about what they've done in the presentation, what all of the panel honestly thought, without saying that to their faces, what they told us they thought, and also what we thought they said they did in terms of acting as consultants and the way they interpreted and communicated information.
So the feedback communication is taking place between staff and students and the employer and the staff.
Absolutely.
All these, there's a dialogue between all these different people involved in the process.
And the interesting thing is that through the years I've been doing this, so say for example when I do my external examiner work and we have discussions on feedback, I'll give that example and I'll say, go for that. People sometimes look a little bit horrified because it is a lot of feedback, but the interesting thing is that sometimes you still get scores of 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 5 for feedback.
Right.
Whereas you'd expect maybe more than 3 out of 5 because you get the students are getting individual feedback every single week on a progressive basis in a way that shapes the work that they're doing. They get feedback on the final version, they get feedback as to the changes they need to make, they get feedback on the presentation, and they get feedback on the whole module, and they get an opportunity feedback to us. But you still get feedback scores of 3 to 4. And without trying to sound arrogant about this, I would expect scores of either 4 or 5 on that in terms of not just the amount of feedback, but what the students say in the end sessions. They love the fact that they get the progress presentations. They get the opportunity to hear from me and any colleagues who are contributing what they should be doing, and they really value that. But they then sort of gave an average score for feedback, even though verbally they say that they really value that and they really rate it and they wish other courses did similar types of things, because they get a progressive feedback every week, as opposed to just getting feedback at the very end of a course when you've given in your essay and you then get a mark back which says, good effort, 65, which doesn't really tell them anything.
No.
So I wonder then whether or not they then realise that what they've had all the way through is feedback.
Yes.
So I've started recently telling them that feedback is happening, and this is your feedback session, and I've now started calling them progress presentations and feedback, rather than just progress presentations every week.
So you think the label itself may be confusing to the point at which students don't quite understand you know, the many possibilities of what feedback might encompass.
Definitely. I think it's a duty on us to flag it up and to explain to them. We know what's feedback, and to us, as experienced practitioners who've been doing this for a number of years and we do it all the time, and we will write something down as the feedback section and know that we're giving them feedback. We can't necessarily expect them to know if it's feedback if the feedback that they've received traditionally has always been written feedback and has been flagged as such. So I think there's a duty on us to actually say this is feedback.
So I think that's very much a transitional issue that needs to be dealt with in the transition from school or college to university. Absolutely. And we need to sort of see it in that sort of way.
Definitely.
Okay. In terms of you talked about getting feedback from students, I wonder whether you might give an example of how your own practice has been improved by feedback you've received from the students that you've been teaching.
Okay, thank you. I think a useful example is the recent module on sustainability, which we both led and contributed to in various elements. Just for the film, that module is a curriculum innovation module here at the university, and it's something which any student from anywhere across the university can take. The feedback that we've received from the students on that module has been universally popular, it's been positive. But one of the useful elements of feedback that they've given is that they were a little bit concerned about the way that the conference presentations were marked and the different roles that people have in the conference presentations. So we get them to do the conference presentations as a group of 5, say, and we say, right, you've got 25 minutes. If you're in a group of 4, you've got 20 minutes, and you're each expected to do 5 minutes. Now, in my mind, that then meant that we could then assess them all equally and fairly, because each student has got 5 minutes to do.
Yes.
What I didn't anticipate, and have learned from when I made changes for next year, was the fact that the students who were doing the introductions, for example, introduction section, they felt that they were at an unfair disadvantage because they didn't really have the opportunity to go into much content, because they were setting the structure for the presentation, introducing the topic area, but not necessarily giving the meat, so to speak, in terms of the analytical data, the real sort of interpretive information.
So they weren't able to show those high-level skills in the way which their peers who were doing the sort of middle bits were able to.
And I think that they were absolutely right.
Yeah.
I think they're absolutely spot on. So that's going to change for next year.
So would you envisage the sort of mark being given to the group, seeing it as a direct group assessment, or would you do it in a different sort of way?
I think what I'm looking to try to do, and we can discuss wider on this, I think that if we gave them a group mark, they'd have problems with group marks then, because they're always going to get some people feeling that their mark was dragged down because somebody else didn't quite do as well as they did, etc. Yeah. So I would prefer not to go down that route. What I'm thinking of doing is just adding 1 or 2 minutes on to each presentation in terms of the time available, and giving the person at the start 1 or 2 minutes in terms of just setting the context and just having the introductory section, and making it clear to them that that is a part which is ungraded, and then they've got the remaining 5 minutes in terms of they can then have an element of being able to do proper content.
Right. Okay. Oh, that's interesting. So it's interesting to notice how students are very sensitive to those possibilities, and I think that makes sense, having seen those presentations, why they might feel that way.
It was a valid response, and I think that another example of where feedback is hopefully going to improve that module is that the students felt that they didn't get quite enough guidance on the sustainability films that they needed to make.
Right, yes.
In terms of not just the guidance, but how we were going to mark them. So they didn't quite appreciate some of the importance of the ability to have something in the way of editor of production skills. Although, as you know, we weren't asking for top-end production elements of the film, but there were certain elements within there that had to be done right in terms of the ability to hear the audio, etc. And we didn't quite make that clear enough in the guidance to the students. And also, I don't think we made enough. Some of them said they didn't quite get the sense that they had to have so much in the way of academic content in the film, and yet we were marking them on that. So we need to make that more explicit for next year. Yes. And I've already made the revisions to the instructions for that. So that was, again, very useful feedback from the students.
Yeah, I mean, we should say, you know, for the benefit of the for the film, this is actually a very demanding module, isn't it, with lots of different types of assessment, and it's certainly one which is pretty demanding, I think, on student time and effort. You know, but they seem to enjoy it, didn't they? I mean, we got good impressions from the feedback they gave us over, you know, in the discussions and things. So it seemed that the students were enjoying it and benefiting and learning new things. You know, we had people from all over the university doing this module, so people were able to bring different perspectives and expertise in. So
I think that's useful for students as well, in the fact that they were able to get feedback between themselves as well. There were some groups where, unfortunately, the module was dominated by environmental science students, which was unfortunate because they are the ones who are much more aware of sustainable development issues at the start of the module and come at it from a scientific perspective. The ones I've spoken to said they learned a lot from working with students from other courses because they gave an entirely different perspective. So when they were doing work together, they were doing sort of informal feedback, shaping their work and getting a perspective from different disciplines. So the sort of feedback they were having in their groups was working and shaping the way that they then approached their assignment, but also the way they approached sustainable development as a result. And I found it interesting that at the start of the module, when we asked them for feedback of what they mean by sustainable development, they were uniformly, it's all about the environment, preserving the environment, etc. Towards the end, the definitions and understanding has shifted towards social, and they're more concerned with social elements. And that was, I put a lot of that down to not just the content we gave in class, but also the interactions between the different student discipline groups. So that I found as a good example of how you get feedback working within the student groupings themselves. I think one of the more interesting things I found as well in terms of the informal feedback discussions with the students was chatting to the ones who were not from environmental sciences, who said that they got a different perspective in terms of their overall discipline from working with scientists, for example.
Right,
and the way also the way that we taught the module, the way we challenged them differently. So they appreciated different types of assessment that they don't normally get in their disciplines. And the feedback from the students, was that they actually welcomed that. So they do like a variety of assessment. And I think that's an important feedback point that I picked up from a number of students over the years, that there is a certain monotony of going through another exam, another essay to write, another exam, another essay to write. They actually appreciate having different types of assessment that set different skills and require different ways of thinking and different ways of learning.
Okay, so one of the things I'd like to think about, we talk a lot about, you know, your individual practice, but at a sort of higher, sort of senior management level or policy level within the university, I mean, what sort of feedback policies or practices do you think should be embedded into the way that we all do things?
Tricky question. I think the university has actually made quite a lot of positive, significant steps regarding feedback. They've been bringing in external experts to give feedback sessions to members of staff who are responsible for feedback within their disciplines. Within the Faculty of Engineering and Environment, for example, within each of our programmes, we are required to have a feedback officer, now an academic member of staff, who is responsible for feedback policy across the whole of our particular course. Now, I don't know whether that's replicated in other parts of the university, but I think that it's something which should be, because from my perspective, working as an environmental scientist, when we farm our students off to different modules in different parts of the university, it'd be good to know that there is a consistency in terms of the approach to feedback across the whole university. So I think there does need to be clarity there. I think that if it doesn't already happen, then there should be a feedback officer for each individual programme, just as there is, say for example, an employability officer or a programme coordinator. There should be a specific role there so people can oversee the feedback, and then that person can then make sure that all the markers do work within the university framework of setting a defined number of working days that the feedback has to go back to the students by. I think that's particularly important in the midterm, because quite a lot of the midterm work informs what's going to be submitted later on in the module, and also how they're going to approach the exam.
So the feedback needs to come where it can be used for improvement on that particular module, and not just some inexpressible future date.
Exactly, and it shouldn't just be feedback for just the sake of giving feedback. It should
Yeah.
be feedback that is informative, that actually shapes the way students approach their later work, that really helps them and guides them and lets them know where they are making errors, where they are demonstrating good practice, and allowing them to build on their strengths in those areas. So I think it has to be done within set periods, which are dependent on the subject area, obviously, in the module. But I do think there has to be consistency in terms of the time taken to give the feedback. I think that a certain amount of innovation should be encouraged. I think that people should try different ways of feedback and have the freedom to do so. So I think any policy shouldn't be too restrictive in that sense. I think the work that we're doing here on curriculum innovation is absolutely brilliant. I think it should be welcomed by the rest of the academic community, and it should be a way that it demonstrates the different imaginative ways that staff are giving feedback, because I know some of the other members of staff who are leading modules on that programme, and they're trying completely different ways of giving feedback as well, and different types of assessment. So I think there's a lot of good practice which is emerging, which does need to be picked out. But I think the important thing is this then needs to be properly communicated and disseminated across the university.
Yes, so you know, we want good practice throughout for everybody, and that's perhaps one of the sort of challenges that we currently face, is ensuring that you know, it's not just individuals doing good practice, but the good practice is expected from everybody who teaches in the university, and yeah, that's yeah, I mean, that's the most important aspect, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's going to take a long time as well, because to be completely honest, there are still a number of practicing academics and lecturers across this university and all universities, because with my sector-wide role within the Higher Education Academy, I do go to many of the universities,
yes,
and you are still going to get people who would just give the bare minimum amount of feedback and maybe don't meet the turnaround dates, and that's going to take quite a while for that culture to change. And I think it's particularly challenging within a research-intensive university, where you might have some people who aren't so necessarily focused on the teaching and feedback as their main priority. Right. I think hopefully that's going to change, and I think that one of the potentially positive outcomes of the introduction of the tuition fees and the increased role and importance of students within the university is that expectation might become more ingrained, and it might actually make a difference to the way people start approaching the work in that area. But I think it is going to take a while, but I think that's why examples of best practice across each institution and within different subject areas do need to be celebrated, and it does need to be recognised by staff that you do actually get recognition for doing that. Otherwise, what's the incentive for staff to do it? If they feel they're going to get more recognition from churning out another research paper, that's going to get a number of citations, then they're obviously going to prioritise that, because you're going to get more recognition, which is going to help in terms of your future promotion prospects, for example.
Yes.
So it's a long process. It has to be built into the promotion guidance criteria as well, in terms of certain expectations with regards to teaching having equal parity to research. Otherwise, why would members of staff do it? Because there's no incentive to do it.
This is as much an HR issue, I suppose, as
it has got a lot to do with HR, definitely. Because I think that you've got to be able to reward people. If you don't reward academic members of staff in different ways, then they're always going to prioritise the way where they know they can get reward.
Yes.
So there's a lot of changes need to be made. I think it should be welcomed that there is a move to increase the clarity of guidance then education promotion criteria across the university. That certainly has happened of late, and that's good. But it's a matter of that being able to then feed down across the rest of the university, and that's still going to take a little bit of time yet.
Yes, okay. And one of the things we've been thinking about as well is about sort of feedback that helps students throughout their whole course or their whole experience. So it's I mean, you know, we can give good feedback on an individual module, but if that module isn't within the broader context of their studies, then you know, what can we do to ensure that our the feedback we give helps them beyond the individual module we're teaching on?
I think you hit the nail on the head earlier, really, by mentioning about the importance of transition. I think it's about a cultural element of making sure that the students recognise the role that each module fits in the broader context of the course. So I think that needs to be made apparent at the start the start of the programme, start of their studies year, the very start of the first year, that the modules build on future modules. So the feedback you're likely to receive in early modules in the first year will inform how you conduct yourself in that module, and the knowledge you gain from that module will form the grounding for the modules you do in year 2 and the modules you do in year 3. So they need to recognise what the feedback is there, and that means that we have to be much clearer with them what is feedback within the very start of their studies. So students, as we all know, students sometimes struggle to make that leap between school or college and then university, because it is completely different. In many ways, even though we still use newer technology here at university, we're still pretty much standing up and talking to people for 45 minutes at a time. That is still the dominant force of teaching.
Yes.
And that hasn't really changed other than the technologies used to deliver that. Whereas in schools, everything has changed, and I don't think we've necessarily kept pace with that. I think that within the work that I've heard about within schools is very much on short, sharp exercises,
right.
10, 15-minute chunks, then do an activity, bang, 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 bang. Students haven't got the attention span to go through 45 minutes when they first enter. And the danger there is then, if you're going to give feedback within the courses, within your lectures, they might then miss that as well. So that then comes back to the flagging of what is feedback. So I think that needs to be recognised and implemented into all the modules right from the very start. I think that the feedback that people receive at the end of year 1 is critical, because there is still the problem that students don't necessarily perform as well as they could in year 1, because they know it doesn't count.
Yes.
They know that all they have to do is just pass to go through. That is a big problem as far as I'm concerned, because year 1 it's glossed over. People think that it's got no importance, so the students think that a lot of the time.
Right.
But they are right in thinking it's got no importance from their perspective, because we give them that message by saying, well, you're not going to get any marks for this in terms of counting towards your future, towards your final degree. So clearly we're then saying that it's not important. But the reality is, the work they learn in those first years is critical to everything doing years 2 and year 3. So I think that within the context of the course, we've got to get it right within year 1. And the feedback they receive at the end of year 1 has got to be very much along those lines of saying, what's going to be the change for year 2? Now, I know that our students, they have the shock of their lives when they go into year 2, because all of a sudden the quality of the work and the expectations is much stronger, much higher.
Right.
The intensity of the work is much stronger as well. And they struggle with that. We try to make it clear to them at the end of year 1 and at the start of year 2 when we give them the introductory lectures and the welcome back. But not everybody turns up to those sessions. So if you're going to give feedback in that sense, then how do you approach it? Because if you send an email out to everybody, you've got no control mechanisms whether or not people know how to read that email.
No.
You get them all in a room and you can talk to them about the importance of what they've got to do within year 2, how they should approach different modules, how they should incorporate the best practice learning they built on in year 1 into the studies in year 2. But if they don't then turn up, then you've lost that message to the students.
Yes.
So that then comes back to, is feedback written, verbal? If it's verbal and it's going to be in class, how can you ensure you give it to everybody? You can only ensure you give it to everybody if everybody's there. How do you get everybody to be there? That's a problem.
Right,
you take registers, or in some universities, and I'm quite in favour of this in our university, you can have smart cards. You can have smart card readers where their university card, they simply swipe it in as they go in. Then you keep the register of their attendance. But you can only be sure if people have received the feedback if they're there. You can't then ensure if they're actually taking it in.
No.
You can do the sort of things that I like doing, which you see me do, where if somebody's falling asleep or something, I'll shout to them awake and sort of go and shake them sort of thing.
Yes.
But even then, the ones who are awake, you don't really know whether they're listening, taking in the feedback, or whether they're thinking about where they're going to go that night or what shopping they've got to do later. So,
yes.
It is a problem. I think verbal feedback is more effective in many ways, because you can explain things clearer to people. But written feedback, at least then when you hand it over, even then you never guarantee they're going to read it, but you can hope that they will.
Do you have a feeling, do you have a sense of how well students are doing generally on your on the environmental science programme, not just in the bits you teach, but the bits other people teach? Do you feel you have a strong grasp of
Absolutely.
who's doing well and who's might be having difficulties?
We do. You can tell that from the very first exam board at the end of semester 1. And this is why I'm always in favour of us having split semester, 2 semesters and having exams in semester 1 and finishing the modules in semester 1 and finish semester 2. I think the model some of the universities use over across the whole year. Yeah. I think that's dangerous because you can't necessarily pick people up at that point. Right. We can, through doing that, through doing the exam boards, you can pretty much pick up who are the ones who are doing okay, who are the ones who are struggling. I think the tutorial system is critical for that because we can identify the ones who aren't turning up for the tutorials in the first year. Yes. And chase them up. But you do get a sense of who's doing well and who's not. You can pick it up a bit from lectures as well, in that ones who are asking more questions and thinking more clearly, the quality of their questions tends to indicate whether or not they're really getting the work. Yes. You will get some who are just confident and yes. will ask questions, but the quality of the questions is quite weak, and they don't really, and you can sort of you get a sense that they don't necessarily understand as detailed as other people. Right. But then the quieter ones in the audience, you just don't really know until you start seeing some work through. So you can only really start seeing, get a gauge of how well they're doing as you start seeing work. But I think that we get, within University of Southampton, we get very good NSS scores. And our KISS data is very strong as well. But I think a lot of that has got to do with the fact that we're very much hands-on with those students. Right. And we make a point of getting to know them all. So say, for example, if I'm teaching one of my second year or my third year modules, I will know the name of every single student in that class, and I make a point of that. And the reason I make a point of that is to make the students feel more relaxed, make them feel more comfortable, and make them feel that they can then ask me any questions if they are struggling at all. And I think that, and I know other colleagues do exactly the same in environmental sciences, and I think that makes a difference because students feel more relaxed, they feel more comfortable, they feel that they can really sort of engage with us and don't feel afraid of approaching us, particularly if they've got a personal problem as well. Right, yes. And that then allows us to get a sense of who's doing well and who's not. You can tell the ones who are doing well. You get a sense for it, but you can only get that sense for it if you take the time to get to know the students and you really think about it.
Yes, so this is actually a conscious act on behalf of the...
yes, absolutely.
It's not something that happens automatically. No.
So, it's got to be a conscious act.
So I wondered, as a sort of final question, what advice regarding sort of being a good giver and receiver of feedback would you give to a new member of academic staff? What sort of advice and guidance would you give them in this area?
Be open. I would say that you need to identify to the students, make it clear to them when they are receiving feedback, and also ask them for feedback within those terms. Make sure students have an opportunity to give feedback halfway through a module as to how it's going, and also towards the end of the module as to what worked, what didn't work. Make sure that they have the opportunity to fill in the forms online and encourage them to do so, and to do it openly as well, because they're anonymous, so people feel more comfortable with that. I think that the mechanism I was talking about earlier with my environmental management systems module, which I then replicated in my environmental auditing module, isn't for everybody. It is a huge amount of work. Yes. But it's also not for everybody because of the fact that it depends on the subject that you're teaching. I think what feedback mechanism you employ, and there are many different ways you can do it, depends on the nature of the subject, and it depends on the way that you can teach that. But I do think that new members of staff should try to tailor and structure their modules so you can build the feedback into it as you're going through. I think progressive feedback staged as you go through is invaluable. What I was talking about earlier with EMS, without being too cocky about it, I know it works because I see the quality of the work at the end. Yes. And I think that really helps. It's not a matter of giving the students the answers. Sometimes people get worried they give the answers. It's not. You give them guidance, you give them support, you give them feedback and let them know where they're going, what they need to think about, etc. So I think that it has to be an iterative process, it has to be two-way, and I think also get to know your students. They're going to receive feedback from you much better if they feel that you're being honest with them and that you know and understand them, and equally they will give you better, more honest feedback. And I think that giving students the opportunity to explain their work, I think is important because I think you've got to be fair with the market as well.
Okay, well thank you very much, Simon, for agreeing to be in this video, and thank you for your contribution to our project.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been fun. Thank you.